It's great having you all here today. Thank you for coming to our White House luncheon. It is a real treat for us to have not one, but two former White House social secretaries with us today. And I'm sure they are very grateful that they did not have to plan and execute this White House luncheon. One of our guests today is a Democrat, one a Republican. They aren't afraid to be friends, they support one another, and they even show up in public together. Imagine that. Originally from a small town in Ohio, Lea Berman served as White House Social Secretary from 2004 to 2007 under President and Mrs. George W. Bush. Prior to that, she was Chief of Staff to Second Lady Lynn Cheney, and before that served as Social Secretary to Vice President Cheney. When asked how she landed those jobs, I believe she'll tell you she was in the right place at the right time. And having known of her for many years, I can tell you that she was most assuredly qualified for all of those roles. As she tells it, she's been an event planner her entire adult life, including as a wife, full-time mom to two now adult daughters, and a couple of dogs. She hosts a daily blog called America's Table, which I now have secretly bookmarked on my own computer up at my desk. Don't tell anybody. Lea offers up hints and treats involving travel and home life and cooking and food, glorious food, and tips on entertaining and etiquette, which she says, quote, is not just about knowing which fork to use, it's about treating each other with kindness, even and especially in the anonymous abyss of the internet. Our second guest today originally hails from San Antonio, Texas, but now he is a fellow Southern Californian. Jeremy Bernard served as the White House Social Secretary under President and Mrs. Obama from 2011 to 2015. Jeremy is the first man ever to serve in this role at the White House. And while that was big news at the time, he managed to keep a very low profile in order to do his job, which, as all White House staffers are advised, is to serve the President and the First Lady of the United States of America, not yourself. He earned a reputation as being both affable and extraordinarily efficient when managing literally hundreds of events with a very young staff, and dare I say it, a lot of laughter. Before serving in the Obama White House, he earned his stripes as a campaign fundraiser for presidential candidate Barack Obama, and then was rewarded with a job as the White House liaison to the National Endowment for the Humanities. From there, Jeremy served as the senior advisor to the U.S. ambassador in France. And again, after being in the right place at the right time, he landed his role as the White House Social Secretary. It is a real pleasure to have them with us today, and I hope you will be ready to ask them some questions later. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming former White House Social Secretaries Lea Berman and Jeremy Bernard. Thanks.
Thank you.
So we're going to get settled in, and before we get to the book, I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room who is very interested in your backgrounds. So can you tell us, how do you get to be the Social Secretary of the United States? Lea, we'll start with you.
It's very different for every person who's had the job, I believe. Traditionally, they were daughters of governors or senators, or their families were in politics in some very formal and aristocratic way. And it hasn't been like that, though, for some time now. Jeremy and I could serve as examples of that. I grew up on a small farm in Ohio. I went to Washington after college, and I worked at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which was Georgetown University's think tank, and went to graduate school there. And then I was a full-time mother for 10 years, which incidentally was the best possible experience to be a social secretary. And after that, a friend of mine said, you know, Mrs. Cheney is looking for a social secretary. You should talk with her. And that's kind of how it all happened after that. And I found myself going from the carpool line one day to learning how to use the White House email system and learning how to clear people into the Vice President's home, working with the Secret Service. So it was a big learning curve, but also I felt very fortunate that I got pushed back into the workforce that way.
Jeremy.
I had just moved to Paris to start working for the U.S. ambassador, and I got text or an email that said, would you be willing to throw your hat in the ring for this job? I was like, yeah, right. I'll never, not in a million years, but I thought, sure. And I went to Washington, D.C., and had meetings with all the senior staff in the West Wing. And then as I was going over to the East Wing to meet Mrs. Obama, I realized, wow, these meetings are going really well, but what am I getting myself into if this was to happen? And after Mrs. Obama came in and we were talking a little bit, I said, I've got to be real honest with you. I'm not good at arranging flowers, and I don't know China patterns. I'm not certain I'm the right guy for this job. And she said, no, don't worry about it. You'll have people there that'll help you with that. I need someone with good political judgment, and how do we get more people that have never been here into the White House. So it was, when I got it, I was kind of like, this is surreal, because it's never been a job I thought I would have, but I loved it, and it was very exciting.
So I'm interested, most White House staffers don't actually interview with the boss. They interview with the boss of the boss of the boss, underneath. However, you two actually interviewed with the boss. So I'm interested, what's their standard interview question?
I was asked to come see Mrs. Bush in the family residence, and I'd only ever been in that part of the White House once before, and I was dazzled. There is this big fan window that you see on television shows about the White House, and the sun was shining in, and everything is beautiful, and the artwork is amazing, and Mrs. Bush was so warm and welcoming and pleasant, and she started talking about the job as if I'd already had it, and saying things like, I want to entertain a lot more, I need you to work with the chef because he's got some issues, and we've been trying to work with him, but I think you should try. And it was almost like a list of things that I should expect to do. And I went in thinking maybe I was talking to her about this and going to recommend someone else. And I was so dazzled that I honestly, if she'd said, we need an upstairs maid, could you take that over? I would have said yes, And afterwards I came out and thought, wow, I have a job.
The interviews in the West Wing were with one advisor after another, so they were relatively brief, 15 minutes, and the president was very brief and he very reassuring. And then Mrs. Obama, that interview lasted an hour, and I can honestly say when I left, I had no idea how it went. I mean, I didn't think it was a disaster, but I didn't think, like when I was in the West Wing, I was like, this was knocked out of the ballpark. And I called my mom on my way back to the hotel and said, this is a day I'll never forget. I had meetings at the White House. I really had a reason to go. And I interviewed with the First Lady and the President. This was an amazing day. I'll remember always. And I kind of assumed I wasn't going to get the job. And I went back to Paris, and I didn't hear anything. I didn't see all the articles that were in Washington Press. So when I got a call a couple of weeks later saying, would you fill out this paperwork? You already have security clearance, but just in case it's you, would you fill this out? And so then I started to think, well, maybe there's a chance. But I was surprised when I got that call. But she's a good interviewer. She wasn't tough. It was just, she has a good poker face. So I had no idea. Later she told me, she goes, I knew from the moment we were talking that you were going to be my social secretary. And I was just like,
Well, they say that in the first 5 minutes. So it's interesting that, you didn't? Okay. Well, now let's talk about this new book that the two of you have co-authored, and you've entitled it, Treating People Well, The Extraordinary Power of Civility at Work and in Life. So I want you to tell us, how did you turn from being the top social dogs at the White House into authors? How did this book come about? And with your distinctly different political views, how did you decide to write it together?
Well, we have been friends since we met. There is this wonderful network of former White House social secretaries in Washington. They get together regularly, and they provide themselves as a resource to whoever the current social secretary is. So when Jeremy became social secretary, we met, and we just clicked and stayed friends. And It was very helpful to me at the time that I started as social secretary to be talking to someone like Letitia Baldridge, who worked for Jacqueline Kennedy, and have her tell these horror stories of things that happened to her when she was the social secretary. For example, when she first began working as social secretary, Mrs. Kennedy told her that she wanted a French chef in the White House. And so Tish had heard about this wonderful French chef who was working in the French embassy in London, so she called and offered him the job. And the chef reported this to his boss, the French ambassador, who reported it home to the Élysée Palace. The French were very offended, and she found herself early in her career being called on the Oval Office carpet by President Kennedy, who told her under no circumstances was she to poach any French chefs. But on the other side of the coin, she had Mrs. Kennedy saying, I want a French chef. So in typical social secretary maneuvering, she found another French chef. She worked with immigration and customs, and she had him made a US citizen overnight. So Mrs. Kennedy got her French chef, but she did not violate President Kennedy's rule that it had to be an American citizen.
But the good old days when you could get something like that done overnight.
Right.
It is a great resource. I would call on Leigh. I called on Gail Burt a great deal, who worked for Reagan. And I would say, did this ever happen to you? And they'd be like, oh yeah, this is what's going to happen. And it wasn't that they had the magic answer all the time, but there was comfort in knowing others went through the same horrible or miserable experiences. And I hate to tell this one at lunch, so I'll make it as pleasant as possible. But like I said, did you ever have problems during the holiday receptions with people getting sick? And the eggnog at the White House is really strong.
Really strong.
And it hits you really quick. And you're drinking it, it's like, this is nothing. And then the third one, and you're like, and what would happen is people would be drinking, and it suddenly hit them, and they would feel themselves getting sick. They didn't want to get sick on someone else, so they immediately went toward one of the Christmas trees. So they were like, oh yeah, we had vomit trees. You know, it was how many would get hit, and there was always kind of a game to figure out how many trees would get decorated by visitors. But it was so a lot of it wasn't that they had the answer, but it was kind of like, don't worry, this has happened before.
Misery does love company.
Right.
Yeah.
The politics didn't matter because we had similar experiences, however different the administrations may have been that we worked in. And we found we were changed by the job because we're very focused on making sure that all of the events go smoothly, that they reflect the style and the policies of the administration and the President and First Lady. And that made us very conscious of getting everything right so that we didn't do anything that would embarrass the President and First Lady and, worst possible thing, be in the news as a negative press story. And that's how we came around to writing the book, because we realized we learned so many of the same things about getting along with people more effectively so that we could make sure that our events flowed well and people felt happy and welcomed.
And in all, give credit is that I had dinner with a mutual friend of ours, Roxanne Roberts, with a reporter at the Washington Post, and she said over dinner, you are close to all the former socials, but you're especially close to Leigh. You guys should write a book together, because no one's not going to buy it because it was Bush, or not going to buy it because someone was Obama. You guys got it covered. And I thought, well, that's a great idea. It took us a while to figure out what to write, because we didn't want a book about entertaining. There's been a number of them. So it did take a little time to figure out what to write, but what we really figured out is what book do we wish we had had before we started this job or any job. And a lot of it is common sense, but it helps when it's spelled out.
Well, and that leads me to my next question, which I think you just said it. It's a great book to have for your jobs, but I can honestly tell you, it's not just for the jobs at the White House Social Secretary. Honestly, it's filled with great stories, little hints, wonderful little tidbits that really apply to all of us every day, whether you're a stay-at-home mom or you're the CEO of a company or you're somewhere in between. And I will say that the first time I looked at it, I looked and I said, Civility's not really a sexy topic, but I've had people say that this is not your grandmother's etiquette book, and I've even read where some people called it dishy. So let's face it, we all love a little dish now and then. So I'm hoping that the two of you can each tell us the most frightful behavior you witnessed during your White House days. And feel free to leave out names if that helps you tell the story. We'll start with you, Jeremy.
Well, there's a lot of them. But one is that Gail Burt had warned me that at one point in all administrations, someone that is an entertainer and is scheduled to perform will cancel at the last minute. Now, the White House, you had no contract because they were doing it for free, and you weren't paying for anything other than sometimes the transportation and hotel room. So it was just their word that they were going to show up, and I thought, well, that's not going to happen. We have no problem getting entertainment. Well, a week before one of Mrs. Obama's favorite events, the kids' state dinner, which is really a lunch, but it's for kids. So I got a call that the entertainment, that for this person to appear, they needed to have a private jet for all of the backup dancers as well. And there were 60 people he was bringing. I said, if 60 people, we'd have to throw some of the kids out. The East Room isn't that big. And, but they demanded that, demands were outrageous. And I said, well, we could never do this. Would be, if we could do it, it would be bad press for both of us. And they said, well, then we'll just have to try to make it happen another time. I said, let me make it real clear. We will never pay, the White House will never pay for entertainment. And that was the word telling Mrs. Obama, because of course the feeling was that how did that happen? What did you not tell? And I had texted Mrs. Obama, and I got a text back saying, talk to Barack. He'll have some ideas. And so I was
So
like,
you just said that very casually. I just texted
I was
Mr.
like,
Obama.
so it was the middle of Syria and whatever else, and I passed Susan Rice, and I go in there and said, yeah, can we talk about the kids' state dinner? And he was like, let me see, maybe there's a military plane that's coming over. I said, he wants 60 people. And I said, we looked into it, and we can, what was the show?
The Lion King.
The Lion King was thank you, my memory. The Lion King was at the Kennedy Center, and so we had them come perform. But, even that, when I talked to the president about it, he goes, yeah, that's a good idea. You're going to tell Mrs. Obama? Like, yeah. So, it was awful. But it was really a shock that someone would commit to performing at, especially something like a kids' state dinner. And I don't want to say the name because it's not treating
Those are the
people well,
rules, yeah.
but it's Pharrell Williams.
But I am relieved, I think we all are, to know that we're not paying, taxpayers aren't paying for entertainment at the White House.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you have it good one.
I would have to say that the most difficult guests were always members of Congress. So there is a sense of entitlement there, and whether it was an individual senator or the entire congressional picnic, I have some very negative memories. I remember waiting to greet a senator who was coming to see President Bush up in the family residence, and I saw him pull up to the north portico, and he opened the door, and I saw him take a bottle and drink something and sort of smush it around in his mouth and spit it out on the steps of the White House. And then he stumbled up, because he was clearly very drunk. And I took him up to his meeting, and I thought that was fairly appalling. But then, you go to these congressional picnics, which are an annual, very painful thing. It's all members and their spouses and their immediate family, and they all defy the rules, and they'll show up with not just their kids, but the 10 interns that they just hired that day. And they'll be at the gate, and they'll be very angry that all of the guests can't be cleared in immediately. But we have rules we have to follow. Name, date of birth, social security number, place of birth. All of that information has to be fed to the Secret Service, and then they have to come back to us and say, yes, they can come in. So there was no way we could control that, and they would be very irate. And then they'd come into the picnic, which was always at least 1,200 people, and it was always very, very hot, and they would just smother the president and first lady and surround them, and it was quite unpleasant for them, and they'd be out there for hours and hours, and then many of them would be overserved, as we would say, and have trouble finding the porta potties. And finally, they would all sort of stumble home, with the centerpieces tucked under their arms, and we'd be thinking, oh, good riddance. So I'm sure there are wonderful members of Congress, but those aren't the ones who stand out.
Yeah, it's funny because in talking with my predecessors, everyone had the same reaction, and that is the most feared event every year is the congressional picnic, because it would happen in the summer. It was hot, and it was long, and there were so many people. And to your point, I was as everyone was leaving. The nice thing is when the sun starts to go down, you kind of push people along, and it's time to leave. And I noticed one congressman kind of, and he was heading toward a food warmer. And I was like, well, what on earth? And I realized, I think he thinks it's a porta potty. Huh? And so there was a moment where bad Jeremy said, oh, just sit back and watch this. But I got a hold and he said, oh, sir, the exit's over there. If you need to use the restroom, you have to go inside. And he stumbled on out. But I still go back and forth of whether I should just have let that happen. But
Little devil on your shoulder.
yes, exactly.
I think a lot of people think that the White House Social Secretary is really meant to deal with the politics of an event. And that certainly is one of the toughest jobs that probably is never discussed in an interview, and it's certainly not on the job description. But it seems to me that it's not so much about the politics, but about the people, as we've just been talking about. So this time, I wonder if you each have a little story, and we do want names this time, of one event or an occasion during your White House that gives us hope that people really can be good to one another. Leigh.
My favorite story let me just say more generally to go back. For most people, coming to the White House is a really important milestone in their life. And they tell their family about it. They want the pictures. They want to take home little paper napkins with the presidential seal. They're very proud of it. My favorite thing was watching people enter the White House for the first time. And they look around at the portraits and the columns. And you can just see them thinking, I share a common heritage as an American with all the people who lived in this house. And they often become very emotional. And it's just a very lovely, reinforcing thing to see this kind of pride in America. And I'm sure that every social secretary has seen that many times.
Yeah, most of the experiences it's funner to talk about the negatives, but were positive. I'll never forget, we had the portrait unveiling of the Bushes, George W. and Laura Bush at the White House. And we had a lunch for the family beforehand, and then the ceremony. And then about a week later, I got a letter, handwritten letter. Laura Bush, whose office had called my assistant and said, Laura wants to send something to Jeremy, but knows, if someone sends something to the White House, if you ever get it, it takes months. And also that anything that goes to the White House becomes public record, and she wanted this to go to me. So I got home one day, and this beautiful handwritten note from Mrs. Bush saying how welcome they felt and how, she noticed what china I used their personal china from upstairs and the tablecloth. She noticed everything and thanked the chefs for making enchiladas, which is one of President Bush's favorite. But getting something like that, and it's just a moment, it takes for someone to write, but it's thoughtful, and it really means a great deal.
Which leads perfectly. That's in the book. It's one of the topics in the book. Going through it, being consistent, having self-confidence, using humor and charm, you call them the great equalizers, being loyal and honest, listening first and talking later. They're just a few of the 12 practices that they both are illustrating in the book as the cornerstones of the art of treating people well. They all sound obvious, right? Common sense. But not all of them come easy to most people. So I'm going to ask each of you, if you had to choose just one place to start, which practice would fall at the top of the list and why? Jeremy?
The top of the list, because of the times we live in now, we have a lot of benefits of technology and getting information so quick. But I feel like because of the becoming accustomed to immediate response, that sometimes people don't step back and really listen. And one of the things, one of our chapters is listen first and speak last. It's really hard in this day and time to get people to really listen to someone else. It's hard. When I see someone in a store and they're on the headsets or something, talking to someone in the midst of a conversation, and they're at a cashier or something, I find it so unbelievably rude because you're not even acknowledging the person that's right across the way. But it's become very normal these days, and I think it's one of the more important things for these times.
Leigh?
I also think humor is an incredibly powerful tool. You know, we often say, I'm not naturally funny or I'm not naturally charming, but all of those behaviors are learned behaviors. And while there are people who are naturally funny, like Jeremy, there are people like me who had to try to find a way to learn that. And you know, our most favorite and beloved presidents, and it's perfectly fitting to be talking about Ronald Reagan here today, and we're so honored to be here, by the way, to tell us my favorite story that I tell at every event we do. And it is probably apocryphal. We've never been able to prove that this actually happened. But it's a story about President Reagan out riding horses with Queen Elizabeth in Windsor Park on a visit to England. And at one point, the Queen's horse had a prolonged bout of flatulence. And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And he said, "It's quite all right, Your Majesty. I thought it was the horse." That kind of natural humor, you see, it relaxes everyone, it makes them happy, and to be the individual who can sit in a tense meeting and say that one correct, funny thing that makes everyone relax and be able to work together again, that's a very powerful thing.
That's great. I cannot confirm the story, although I know the president pretty well, but it sounds just like him. So I'm going to go with, I think that's true. We are going to open it up to questions in just a minute, but I want to ask each of you, without getting yourselves in trouble politically, is there one person in Washington, D.C. today that you'd like to have read your book? And if he or she only has time for one chapter, which one would you recommend?
We've already given it to him, and I don't think there's any hope.
We have no idea who she's talking about.
I would like to give it to virtually everyone in Washington, D.C., especially Congress and the press. There's a built-in animosity, and I think that bad behavior is unfortunately very, very contagious. And when you see someone acting rudely or being inconsiderate, it seems to grow because it's giving permission. And so one of the things we felt very early is that it takes a conscious effort to be nice, to be kind in this world, because there's so many things that go contrary to that. And so even though it's fairly obvious, you have to think about it. And even once we started writing this book, I'm living in LA now, in LA traffic, and someone would cut in front of me, and I'd say, don't honk the horn, don't scream, unless they're putting your life or your car in danger. What's it matter? It's going to take another 30 seconds. But it took a real conscious effort because my reaction was kind of what I had learned, and that is scream, honk, and curse.
Yeah, which doesn't work.
Doesn't work.
Might make you feel better. Okay, we are going to open this up to questions. We do have somebody with a microphone, so please wait until you have the microphone because we are live streaming.
Hi, thank you for being here today. This is great. I have a very shallow question. When people ever come to dinner at the White House, do they ever lift the silverware?
It's been known to happen.
Yeah, and can you tell? Do you know when they do it?
There is some beautiful old silver that is engraved the president's house, and we just stopped using it because we didn't have enough pieces to use it because it had been taken. But now we use something that you would see at any caterer so that there's less desire to take it.
Yeah, President Obama would actually say at holiday parties, Take the napkins, take the towels downstairs in the restrooms. Don't take the silverware because it's rented. It's not from here. Because people, you know, it's somewhat natural. Also, and Leah told me about this, for the nameplates at each place, they're an eagle. It's very attractive, and guests would take it. So I was told early on to pick up those before dessert, because most people don't think about it till it gets toward the end. And one of the problems is when we would be short, there was no budget to buy that. I mean, it was like pulling teeth, and they were, what, $50 each? It wasn't but if we were short, it wasn't like, oh, well, we'll just get the slush fund to pay for it. We really didn't have an account to pay for that stuff. So it wasn't just that we wanted to be greedy with it, but we really couldn't part with it.
And the butlers would go to someone very politely, say, excuse me, sir, but I think you just put the place card holder in your pocket, and that actually stays here with the White House, and they'd fish it out very sheepishly, put it back.
Well, the place cards, you allowed them
They
to take
take
them.
them,
They're
yes.
beautifully hand calligraphied still, right?
Right.
I know they were in our White House. And those alone are just so special. And if you have a place card from the White House, you are a very rare person to have that. So it seemed to me that they would be happy with that. But yes, I can
And the
see
menu
anything
card.
that's not wired down, sadly. Even people who attend White House events think that hostess gifts mean everything that's on the table. It's
Right,
sad.
right.
We have another question right here.
I have two quick questions, one general, one specific. The first general one is, if you were to hire the next social secretary, what would be the top qualities that you would look for?
That's a good question. But I think there is something about, we both, when we started these jobs, we talked about it. We were like, what are we doing here? How did we get here? But you kind of play it off as if you belong. And so I think we all have our insecurities, but one of the important things is to be confident enough in yourself that I think everyone at the White House feels like, when are they going to find out the mistake they made and I'm going to be thrown out of here? So it's common, but you don't want to, in front of your staff, appear to be uncertain. And so that, and a sense of humor, and it's hard to say one. Detail's important, so it's kind of a combination. And sense of humor is really important, most of all because when someone says or does something, it could be a guest or it could be someone else at the White House, you got to let it go. And sometimes they can be catty or rude, and you just have to let it go, and that's not always easy.
For various reasons, which we get into in our book, as children, neither of us were particularly extroverted. And when you go through a stage in your life where you feel like an outsider, I think it changes how you deal with people afterward. And I think we were both better social secretaries for having a sense of how uncomfortable and intimidated many times people would be when they came to the White House. And so we would make the extra effort to make them feel welcome. And so I would say every social secretary really needs to be able to reach out and be comfortable and make people feel comfortable there, because that is actually the most important part of the job.
So you're really the bridge between the guest.
And it's not always
the
who you
president.
think it would be. I mean, it's for a lot of first timers, but for one time for Kennedy Center Honors, we had, before the ceremony, you have the family members of the honorees go out and sit in the East Room where the ceremony is going to take place. And so Meryl Streep was being honored that year, and her, someone took her family out, and I said, I'm sorry we had to take your family. She goes, no, I'm glad you got rid of them, but come sit down with me. I'm so nervous. And I was like, you're nervous? She goes, I'm so nervous. I said, I think the president's more nervous about him meeting you than you. And she goes, no, I'm so nervous. And she just wanted comfort. And so it doesn't matter who it is, everyone has that, and it's important to kind of recognize it and be sensitive to it.
I want to recognize that everybody is a person.
Right.
They all have emotions. We had a question over here.
Did you ever have anybody try to change their place cards?
at the dinner table, and how did you handle it if they did
Anybody
swap
try
them
to
out?
what?
Change place
Change
card.
place cards?
Oh, all the
All
time.
the time. Unless it was at the president's table, if it was last minute, the only thing that concerned, no one changed tables, because that's a problem, because then someone else is going to go to the wrong table. But they would change places, and, you know, it was annoying, understandably, but I usually, unless it was at the president or first lady's table, I didn't do anything. If someone moved themselves so they could sit next to him, it's kind of like, well, that's obvious. But
And you know, we, as social secretaries, we often started from a deficit of goodwill, because so many people think they should be invited to the White House, and when they aren't, they tend to blame us. And you know, we took them off the guest list. And so for years afterward, we would run into people who would comment. And I know Jeremy would hear from people who would say, you know, I was never invited while you were there. And at one point, there's a restaurant in Washington called The Palm, and there are lots of sort of caricatures of Washington types on the walls. And I went to dinner with my husband. This was about a year into working as the social secretary, and I looked over at my caricature, and someone had taken a fork and just stuck it all over my face. And I thought, this has got to be someone who thought I took them off a guest list, you know. So it made us be extra carefully nice to people when we could, because in truth, social secretaries really don't take people off lists. Other people around the White House do.
and we can't exactly say, oh, well, Valerie Jarrett said no.
Right.
So we were often the bad guys.
Absolutely. Question over here? Oh, thought I saw a hand over here.
Very shy crowd.
It is a shy crowd.
Jeremy, I have a question regarding the couple that snuck into a party. How did that happen? How didn't they get checked? How did they get in and they weren't on the guest list?
You know, Leigh knows it even better than I do, because I was,
That did not happen on his watch.
yes, let's make that real clear. But it was, in fact, on June 7th of 2011 was my first state dinner for Germany, which was out in the Rose Garden, and it was gorgeous, but I couldn't relax for any of it, because you know that anything that goes wrong is what makes the story. And that gatecrasher certainly did put the fear in the White House that lasted the entire administration of mistakes happening. And it was, unfortunately, the people that really suffer are guests now, because it's such a process. You have to show your ID multiple times.
It's worse than the airplane.
It's really awful. And so it's a shame. They got in, it was the first state dinner. It was, they were dressed as if they belonged, and it was evidently storming that night. And the Secret Service didn't have them on the list, but they were convincing, and they got through. And unfortunately, you know, it cost Secret Service agents
a job or two.
a job or two, and it was really the bad actions of them trying to get attention or getting attention really affected a lot of lives.
You know the television show Real Housewives of LA, Miami, et cetera? There was a production company trying to start a Real Housewives of Washington, D.C. at that time, and the couple, who were the gatecrashers, wanted to get on the show. So they were trying to impress the producer by saying, we got invited to a state dinner. And the woman dressed in a sari, because it was an India state dinner, and their whole plan always was just to get inside, get some photos, and leave before the dinner started, because they would have been discovered then because they had no seats. And a Washington Post reporter who was watching the people come through saw them and thought it was really odd, and asked some of the staff, but you know, they didn't really have time to focus on it until the next morning when they had posted these pictures on Facebook and people realized what had happened. So it was inconceivable that any White House could have ever foreseen somebody trying to do this, because they didn't particularly care about coming to the White House. They cared about getting on the TV show.
I think we had a good question right here. Yes.
I'm
I'm just trying to figure out the logistics of your jobs. There's so much going on so many different levels. How did you coordinate with the other activities that were going on to figure out how things were going to occur, how you fit those in?
I drank a lot. It was the first thing, I actually had advised my predecessor when she took the job, and I went into the office to see her. I said, you should have a big bulletin board or a big, that tells every event of every day, because we would have, from 390 to 410 events a year. So there were some days there'd be 3 events, and some days there'd be nothing, but it was never spaced out the way you would want it to be. And so it really, it was keeping an eye and knowing, it was very difficult, though I would tell my staff, we are so busy going from one event to the other and making one event happen after, don't forget to enjoy the history of it. Because when there's a Medal of Honor or a Medal of Freedom or something, this is a historic moment. This is something that you're not going to see most likely in your post-White House life. But it's difficult because you're going from one to the other to the other. And I lucked out on, well, I actually changed some of the staff once I got there. There was turnover, and having a great staff and people that are detailed, I mainly hired people that had been interns for the social office because they worked the most and had the longest hours. And if they could make it through that, I felt like, well, staff will be easy.
And the social secretary is responsible for every event that happens on the White House grounds, with the exception of the Oval Office and the press room. So the coordination point really is in the social office, and then we work with the ushers, the butlers, the various White House staff, and of course our bosses to make sure that everything is organized and we all know what we're doing. And so there was never a time when, I walked onto the grand floor and found that there was an event going on that I didn't know about.
Multitasker, okay, at the supreme multitaskers. We have one over here.
How did your office interface with the Office of Protocol in the State Department?
We did regularly whenever there were foreign visitors, and certainly state visits required more interaction with them. And then we also had a lot of interaction with the NSC staff because there were regular luncheons with the president and whatever visiting foreign head of state and his delegation would be. And so we would get all of those names from the NSC, their order of precedence, so that I could then pass them along to the calligrapher, and then we would put them in place. And it was almost always flawless, and they were almost always right. There was only one occasion I remember when the Emir of Kuwait was coming for lunch with President Bush, and I got the list from the NSC, and we did it just as they said, and then when the Kuwaiti delegation arrived, there was one extra person there, and he kind of looked around, and there was a flurry of Arabic, and he left, and he was escorted out. And the next day, the Kuwaiti ambassador's wife called me and said, you caused my husband a really big problem yesterday. And I said, how? And she said, that person was supposed to be at the lunch, and he thinks my husband, the ambassador, kept him out of the lunch, and now he has a political problem at home. So these tiny, seemingly insignificant things really would have consequences. And I went back to the NSC, and they were apologetic, and I'm sure they did whatever they needed to do to try to smooth things over, which is why being a social secretary could be nerve-wracking, because something that small could blow up in your face.
The NSC, by the way, is the National Security Council,
yes.
for those of you that don't know that term.
And they're the coordination point for foreign policy with the State Department within the White House.
I worked with the Office of Protocol. I mean, we both, on a almost daily basis. What was a benefit for me was the Chief of Protocol had my job during the Clinton years. So Capricia Marshall was great at, in my first months, and I would ask her, she'd be there, and I'd say, well, what did you do about this, or did you ever have this?
And the Chief of Protocol is assigned to the State Department. They handle our international protocol.
Right.
They're
And
not
so,
on the White House staff.
But it really, and protocol was great because they would tell us right away when we found out a leader was visiting, whether it was for a meeting or a luncheon or a full state visit, what their likes and dislikes were, what colors would be offensive if we had flowers that were white. Was that could be offensive to certain cultures? What food allergies there were? So we relied on State Department and the Office of Protocol a great deal, that was one thing we didn't have to worry about as much because we knew they had that information.
You know, during the Reagan administration, we did have one social office event, a state dinner overseas, and it was during the visit of President and Mrs. Reagan to Moscow when they hosted a state dinner at the ambassador's home, Spaso House in Moscow. Did either of you hold a state dinner or a state event outside of the White House? It's a very rare situation.
Well, whenever we did one of the summits, or APEC, or the G7 or 8, depending on if Russia was coming, it was, those were usually out of town. They could have been, one was at Camp David, one was in Hawaii, and there was one in Chicago. If it was a White House event, we were in charge of it. We also always had to do the United Nations reception when the president would go speak at the United Nations. He would host all the leaders. And so if we're the host country, then we would have to be there. And it was made us realize and appreciate how much we enjoyed doing things at the White House, where you have, not that you really have control over anything, you have a lot more control than, in New York, we had to deal with my first UN trip there we did at the New York Library, which was beautiful. But unfortunately, because Secret Service had to block off so much with pipe and drape, the President and Mrs. Obama they could just as well be in an airport hangar. And so, you'd learn, let's just do it at the hotel. And you just kind of learned by mistake because it wasn't your footprint. It wasn't the usual, which is being at the White House.
So we have time for one more question out here.
Speaking of state dinners, it's my understanding that now when you have state dinners, you serve only American wines. And since we're in California, we're really interested in knowing how those wines get chosen for state dinners.
Well, there was an usher who just recently retired who was a sommelier, and he had connections with all the vineyards up and down the West Coast, and he was very clever about it. He would not just find the wines that fit the food, but he would find wines with really interesting names. And I remember there was a foreign visit with China, which was always problematic for us because the countries are always at loggerheads, and he chose a wine called Conundrum, which I thought was very clever. So I'm sure they have someone else doing it now. But
we actually use that a lot here.
Oh, do you?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he was there the entire time I was at the White House, and it made it easy because we would have wine tasting. He would pick out wines, and for state visits, I would have a tasting with Mrs. Obama and her mom, and we would, especially Mrs. Robinson and I, would be drinking the wine. Mrs. Obama would have a little taste of it, but it was the ability to choose of great selections to begin with. So that was a big plus for us.
We do have a question right here.
Oh, hi, I'm Anne Marie Villicana from Pasadena, and I really enjoyed hearing it, but I was kind of saddened to hear about so many bad behavior events with all the alcohol. And so I was kind of curious, why didn't they ever reduce the number of alcoholic drinks or reduce the alcohol level in eggnog? And on that vein, you were talking about protocol. We hear so much about the protocol that took place with the British wedding recently, and the etiquette that you're supposed to wear a certain thing and speak a certain way. Was there also that kind of thing to visit the White House that people are given?
Well, for the first part of the first question about alcohol, we started having, or I think it was previously, started having non-alcoholic eggnog, and there was, the recipe is such a tradition, there was this, you can't mess with the recipe, but we would have the person that was serving it warn people, hey, this is really potent, and just be careful because, people used to drink a lot more years ago, and now I think for a lot of people it hit quicker. And but we did certainly offer other alternatives and tried to. We were very careful on what events we served alcohol.
Yeah, a lot of events we just didn't have hard liquor. Like the St. Patrick's Day event was a particularly liquid event every year, but also really fun. And then after a nun knocked down one of the military social aides in her zeal to get to the president to shake his hand, we stopped doing that as well, and we just, had a lovely sort of Irish-themed event. But we probably are making it sound worse than it is because you remember the bad behavior, kind of like on media, you hear the bad stories, you don't hear the good stories about people being kind and honest and faithful and so forth. But I think people like to hear some of these more unusual stories. And I understand there are many docents here from the Reagan Library today, and I just want to say thank you for your service, because without the volunteers we had at the White House, both the military and the non-military volunteers, I don't think we could function at all.
Yeah, that's true, absolutely.
So we have just a couple of minutes. I know in the book you have something that you call pearl clutching moments at the White House. Leigh, I know there was a story about somebody getting arrested at one of your events, and there's a little bit of diciness at a couple of your events as well. So I wonder if you could each share one pearl clutching moment, leave us with that. But certainly not the bad, all of the bad stuff, because as you say, there's so many wonderful days and moments at the White House, and to be there, to work there, to attend an event there is an extraordinary opportunity.
Well, I think that we just witnessed yesterday what happens more often than is usually reported, though it's not terribly common, I don't want to say, but when you submit your information to come into the White House, the Secret Service check it. And if you have a warrant for your arrest, they're going to know it. Now, how this idiot showed up at the White House after giving his information and didn't know he would be arrested is kind of shocking, and goes to one of the dumbest possible felons. But we would sometimes I would get a call and they'd say, it'd be the Secret Service, they'd say, look, someone on your list is a do not admit, and we don't want you to be embarrassed by their getting here and getting. So I would call the person, and often it was like, oh, I said, do you get a speeding ticket somewhere? Well, I got a speeding ticket years ago in Georgia. I never paid. I said, it doesn't go away. They attach it, and if you're pulled over, and they're checking the base, they'll see that you have an unpaid parking ticket. And I don't want you to come to the White House and get arrested for having an unpaid parking ticket, or a speeding ticket. So it was always scary to get those calls from the Secret Service. The other thing that happened a lot is people would be stuck at the gate, and I would try to figure out what it was that went wrong, how did the information get mixed up, and then they would usually say to the Secret Service or something, okay, I was actually born in 1963, but my husband thinks it's 1958. So they'd have to resubmit the information.
I had a particularly bad day when we had an official visit from the Chinese president, and I will only tell you the very last part of the horror. It was just as the luncheon was about to begin, and I was approached by a State Department employee who said, the Chinese always try to push the American translator out of the way, and President Bush has to have his own translator, so make sure that doesn't happen. So I walk over to the president's table, and people are just slowly starting to come into the luncheon, and I see a Chinese woman sitting in the American translator seat, and the American translator's kind of nervous and trembling and says, she won't let me sit in my seat. So I walk over and I try to explain to her very politely that she needs to just move over one seat, and she pretended, this is the translator, that she didn't speak English. So I could see that the presidents were starting to come down the hallway, and the thing was about to happen. And so I said to the American translator, when I get the seat open, sit in it and do not leave until the luncheon is over. So I pushed the woman's chair forward a bit, and she jumped up and whirled on me in anger, like, what are you doing? And I could see the Chinese chief of protocol coming at me looking furious, and I shoved the American translator into the chair, and I was literally saved by the Marine band who struck up "Hail to the Chief" as he walked into the dining room. Otherwise, I honestly don't know what would have happened, but that was a pearl-clutching moment.
Yes, that sounds like it. So we're going to leave everybody with one of your best moments at each of your White Houses, if you can help us out with that.
You know, at the end of a state dinner or the holiday receptions, it was, and you would see how happy people were. I remember after the British state dinner, Prime Minister Cameron and his wife turned to me and said, "Thank you for the most amazing special night of our lives." And you kind of were taken back like, well, you know, thank you. But moments like that at the end, you see people that had never been there before leaving, and they're so happy and excited, was always a great moment. And I would get the holiday receptions, there were so many, we couldn't wait for them to end, but when they ended, I was sad because it was the end of a season and it just was so special.
Leigh?
You know, every presidential administration has times when they're up and times when they're down. And as Joanne can tell you, when you're feeling embattled within the White House, it's a daily struggle to just move on and do the best possible job you can do. And I was in the White House at the time when the Iraq War was not going very well. It was before the surge. And the president decided to do an iftar dinner, which is a breaking of the Ramadan fast dinner. And it's a very complicated dinner so that all of the religious observances were done properly by the White House, and we were very focused on it. The East Room was emptied of furniture, the portraits were covered, and prayer rugs were put down. And at exactly the moment of the sunset, an imam stood in the grand foyer and called all of the guests, who were prominent Muslim clerics, ambassadors from countries which had Muslim populations, called them to prayer and invited them to pray in the East Room. And a number of them went in and closed the doors, and the prayers went on, and then they came out and the dinner began. And I remember standing there feeling so impressed and proud that I was working in this White House where, yes, the war was going terribly and everyone was angry at us and thought we couldn't do anything right, and yet we were exhibiting this level of religious tolerance to the very people who had knocked down the towers, and we were able to make that intellectual distinction between terrorism and a religion. And I always think of that as my proudest moment at the White House.
Well, many of you know Ronald Reagan was a man that absolutely understood the extraordinary power of civility in work and in life. He always treated people well, even if he didn't agree with their political views. In fact, he always treated people the same. He did not care if you were the Queen of England or the school bus driver. He always said hello to you, and if there was time, he asked how you were doing, what was going on in your life, and he actually stuck around to hear the answer. He didn't just blow you off. One of my favorite Ronald Reagan quotes, which was engraved on a plaque on the desk in his Oval Office, says, "There is no limit to what a man can do or where he can go as long as he doesn't mind who gets the credit." It reminds me so much of what is in this book, and that I hope all of you will get your copy. And it's a great gift for someone in your life, a daughter, a son, a niece, a nephew, a granddaughter. I hope you all will take the time to do that. And in honor of that plaque, I have one for each of you today. And I want to thank you for coming here and joining us.
Thank you.
Here you go.
Thank you so much.
We are going to take Jeremy and Leigh up to the museum store in just a few minutes. We hope you will all join us up there with your copy of the books. I know they'll be happy to answer questions as you move through the line. Thank you all for coming. We hope to see you again next time.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I tried to get this water like 3 times.
Turn that off, Tyler.